The year was 1944, and the world was embroiled in the chaos of World War II. The temperature on this particular day, June 6th, was a brisk 55 degrees Fahrenheit, with a gentle mist rolling in off the English Channel. The air was filled with the sweet scent of salt water and the acrid smell of gunpowder, as the Allied forces prepared to launch the largest amphibious assault in history. The smell of freshly cut grass and the earthy aroma of damp soil wafted through the air, mingling with the smell of diesel fuel and the metallic tang of machinery. In the early morning hours, the Allied forces, comprising of American, British, Canadian, and French troops, were assembled on the decks of an armada of ships, waiting for the signal to disembark. The ships, a mix of destroyers, cruisers, and landing craft, were anchored off the coast of Normandy, their guns at the ready. The American troops were equipped with the M1 Garand rifle, a .306 caliber semi-automatic rifle that was renowned for its accuracy and reliability. The British troops, on the other hand, were armed with the Lee Enfield No. 4 MKI rifle, a .303 caliber bolt-action rifle that was highly regarded for its durability and range. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the assembled fleet, the sound of engines roaring to life echoed across the water. The landing craft, infantry, LCI, and the landing craft, tank, LCT, were the first to move, their ramp doors opening with a metallic creak as they prepared to disembark the troops. The LCI was a 158-foot-long, 23-foot-wide vessel, powered by 8 General Motors diesel engines, which gave it a top speed of 15 knots. The LCT, on the other hand, was a 114-foot-long, 32-foot-wide vessel, powered by 3 General Motors diesel engines, which gave it a top speed of 8 knots. The troops, dressed in their standard-issue uniforms, were a mix of seasoned veterans and fresh-faced recruits. The American troops wore the M1941 field jacket, a cotton and wool blend jacket that was designed to keep them warm and dry in the field. The British troops, on the other hand, wore the battle dress, a woolen uniform that was designed to keep them warm and comfortable in the cold and wet conditions of the European theater. The air was thick with tension as the troops waited for the signal to move, their hearts racing with anticipation and fear. The signal, when it came, was a burst of artillery fire from the Allied warships, which unleashed a barrage of high-explosive shells onto the German defenses. The sound of the artillery was deafening, a cacophony of booms and cracks that shook the very foundations of the ships. The guns, a mix of 5-inch and 6-inch naval guns, were mounted on the decks of the warships, their barrels elevating and depressing with a slow, deliberate motion as they fired shell after shell onto the German positions. The German defenses, a mix of concrete bunkers and fortified machine gun nests, were designed to withstand even the most intense artillery barrage. The bunkers, built into the side of the cliffs, were made of reinforced concrete, with walls that were up to 10 feet thick. The machine gun nests, on the other hand, were made of wood and sandbags, with layers of barbed wire and anti-tank mines surrounding them. The Germans, dressed in their standard-issue uniforms, were a mix of seasoned veterans and fresh-faced recruits, armed with the Carabiner 98K rifle, a 7.92 mm caliber bolt-action rifle that was renowned for its accuracy and range. As the artillery barrage lifted, the landing craft began to move, their ramps opening with a metallic creak as they made their way towards the shore. The sound of the engines, a low rumble that vibrated through the water, was accompanied by the sound of gunfire as the German defenses opened up on the Allied troops. The machine guns, a mix of the Maschinengewehr 42 and the Maschinengewehr 34, were mounted on tripods, their barrels elevating and depressing with a slow, deliberate motion as they fired bullet after bullet onto the Allied positions. The Allies, undaunted by the withering fire, pressed on, their troops pouring out of the landing craft and onto the shore. The sound of gunfire, a cacophony of booms and cracks, was accompanied by the sound of screaming and shouting, as the troops scrambled to find cover and return fire. The smell of smoke and sweat filled the air, mingling with the smell of blood and the metallic tang of machinery. The temperature, still a brisk 55 degrees Fahrenheit, seemed to drop even further, as the chill of fear and adrenaline coursed through the veins of the troops. The M4 Sherman tank, a 32-ton behemoth of a machine, was the first to make landfall, its tracks rumbling as it made its way onto the shore. The tank, equipped with a 75mm gun and a .30 caliber machine gun, was a formidable opponent, capable of withstanding even the most intense enemy fire. The crew, a mix of seasoned veterans and fresh-faced recruits, was dressed in their standard-issue uniforms, their faces set with determination as they made their way onto the shore. As the tank made its way onto the shore, it was followed by a wave of troops, their rifles at the ready, as they poured out of the landing craft and onto the beach. The sound of gunfire, a cacophony of booms and cracks, was accompanied by the sound of shouting and screaming, as the troops scrambled to find cover and return fire. The smell of smoke and sweat filled the air, mingling with the smell of blood and the metallic tang of machinery. The temperature, still a brisk 55 degrees Fahrenheit, seemed to drop even further, as the chill of fear and adrenaline coursed through the veins of the troops. The beach, a stretch of sandy shoreline that was lined with cliffs and fortified machine gun nests, was a killing zone, a place where the unwary and the unprepared could easily become casualties. The cliffs, which towered above the beach, were made of limestone and sand, their faces pockmarked with holes and crevices. The machine gun nests, which were scattered along the beach, were made of wood and sandbags, with layers of barbed wire and anti-tank mines surrounding them. The Germans, dressed in their standard-issue uniforms, were a mix of seasoned veterans and fresh-faced recruits, armed with the Carabiner 98K rifle and the Maschinengewehr 42 machine guns. As the troops made their way onto the beach, they were met with a hail of gunfire, a withering barrage of bullets that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The sound of the gunfire, a cacophony of booms and cracks, was accompanied by the sound of shouting and screaming as the troops scrambled to find cover and return fire. The smell of smoke and sweat filled the air, mingling with the smell of blood and the metallic tang of machinery. The temperature, still a brisk 55 degrees Fahrenheit, seemed to drop even further, as the chill of fear and adrenaline coursed through the veins of the troops. The M1 Garand rifle, a .306 caliber semi-automatic rifle that was renowned for its accuracy and reliability, was the primary weapon of the American troops. The rifle, which was equipped with an 8-round clip, was capable of firing 30 rounds per minute, making it a formidable opponent on the battlefield. The Lee Enfield No. 4 MKI rifle, a .303 caliber bolt-action rifle that was highly regarded for its durability and range, was the primary weapon of the British troops. The rifle, which was equipped with a 10-round magazine, was capable of firing 20 rounds per minute, making it a highly effective weapon on the battlefield. As the battle raged on, the sound of gunfire and explosions filled the air, a cacophony of booms and cracks that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The smell of smoke and sweat filled the air, mingling with the smell of blood and the metallic tang of machinery. The temperature, still a brisk 55 degrees Fahrenheit, seemed to drop even further, as the chill of fear and adrenaline coursed through the veins of the troops. The beach, a stretch of sandy shoreline that was lined with cliffs and fortified machine gun nests, was a killing zone, a place where the unwary and the unprepared could easily become casualties. The Germans, dressed in their standard-issue uniforms, were a mix of seasoned veterans and fresh-faced recruits, armed with the Carabiner 98K rifle and the Maschinengewehr 42 machine gun. The Carabiner 98K, a 7.92mm caliber bolt-action rifle that was renowned for its accuracy and range, was the primary weapon of the German infantry. The Maschinengewehr 42, a 7.92mm caliber machine gun that was highly regarded for its durability and range, was the primary weapon of the German machine gunners. The Germans, who were dug in behind their fortified machine gun nests, were a formidable opponent, capable of withstanding even the most intense Allied bombardment. As the battle raged on, the Allies began to gain the upper hand, their troops pouring onto the beach and pouring gunfire onto the German positions. The sound of gunfire and explosions filled the air, a cacophony of booms and cracks that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The smell of smoke and sweat filled the air, mingling with the smell of blood and the metallic tang of machinery. The temperature, still a brisk 55 degrees Fahrenheit, seemed to drop even further, as the chill of fear and adrenaline coursed through the veins of the troops. The beach, a stretch of sandy shoreline that was lined with cliffs and fortified machine gun nests, was a killing zone, a place where the unwary and the unprepared could easily become casualties. As the battle commenced, the infantry divisions of the Allied forces, comprising primarily of British, American, and Canadian troops, began to execute their well-rehearsed maneuvers. The initial wave of assault, spearheaded by the British 1st Division, moved forward with calculated precision, advancing flank by flank in a staggered formation. Each battalion, consisting of approximately 1,000 soldiers, was divided into 4 companies, with the lead company assuming the vanguard position. The vanguard company, comprised of the most seasoned and battle-hardened troops, proceeded to probe the enemy's defenses, identifying weak points and concentrations of enemy firepower. Meanwhile, the secondary company, positioned to the rear and right flank of the vanguard, provided covering fire, laying down withering suppressive barrages to pin down the enemy and restrict their ability to maneuver. The remaining 2 companies, holding positions on the left and rear flanks, respectively, served as reserve forces, poised to exploit any breaches in the enemy's lines or respond to emerging threats. As the British 1st Division pushed forward, the American 2nd Division, positioned to their right, initiated a complementary assault, seeking to outflank the enemy's defenses and threaten their lines of communication. The American troops, employing a variation of the feint and thrust tactic, created a diversion on their left flank, drawing the enemy's attention and firepower away from the true axis of advance. Concurrently, a battalion-sized force, detached from the main body of the American division, executed a wide, sweeping maneuver, aiming to encircle the enemy's right flank and sever their supply lines. The Canadian 3rd Division, operating on the Allied forces' left flank, adopted a more cautious approach, advancing in a series of carefully coordinated bounds, with each successive wave of troops leapfrogging the preceding one to maintain momentum and minimize exposure to enemy fire. The Canadians' incremental progress allowed them to methodically clear enemy strongpoints, exploiting the cover and concealment afforded by the terrain to minimize casualties and accumulation of fatigue. Throughout the battle, the artillery components of the Allied forces played a crucial role, delivering sustained and accurate supporting fire to facilitate the infantry's advance. The British and American gunners, proficient in the employment of predictive fire control techniques, precisely targeted enemy positions, adjusting their aim in real time to compensate for the effects of wind, terrain, and target movement. The Canadian artillery, meanwhile, focused on delivering deep, suppressive fire, aiming to interdict enemy reinforcements and logistics, thereby weakening their ability to respond effectively to the Allied assault. The intricate ballet of troop movements and supporting firepower allowed the Allied forces to gradually gain the upper hand, as they began to erode the enemy's defensive posture and undermine their will to resist. However, the enemy, far from being vanquished, continued to wage a determined and resourceful defense, leveraging their knowledge of the terrain and the lessons learned from previous encounters with the Allied forces to adapt and evolve their tactics. As the battle raged on, the outcome hung precariously in the balance, with both sides trading blows and neither able to gain a decisive advantage. The enemy's resistance, though ultimately doomed to fail, served to underscore the complexity and nuance of modern warfare, where the interplay between tactical acumen, technological superiority, and sheer force of will could frequently prove decisive. As the Allied forces persevered, driven by their collective resolve to prevail, the enemy's defense began to exhibit signs of strain, their lines growing increasingly tenuous as the cumulative effects of the Allied onslaught began to take its toll. The battle, now a maelstrom of clashing steel and screaming engines, had become a crucible, where only the most resilient and resourceful forces would ultimately emerge triumphant. In this maelstrom, the Allied commanders, seasoned veterans of countless battles and skirmishes, directed their troops with a deep understanding of the tactical nuances at play. They expertly wove together the various strands of their forces, integrating the disparate components of their army, infantry, artillery, armor, and air support, into a cohesive, harmonious whole. The enemy, though formidable, could not match the Allies' level of tactical sophistication, their defense ultimately foundering on the rocks of the Allied forces' superior training, doctrine, and leadership. As the battle entered its critical phase, the Allied forces, now fully committed to the assault, began to sense the prospect of victory within their grasp. The enemy's lines, once formidable and unyielding, had begun to waver, their defensive posture crumbling under the relentless pressure of the Allied advance. The stage was set for a climactic, decisive engagement, one that would determine the outcome of the battle and, by extension, the fate of the war itself. The Allied forces, their spirits buoyed by the promise of triumph, steeled themselves for the final, brutal push, knowing that the enemy would not relinquish their ground without a ferocious, last-ditch struggle. As the armies clashed on the battlefield, the sound of gunfire and cannon fire filled the air, creating a deafening din that made it difficult for commanders to communicate with their troops. The smell of gunpowder and smoke hung heavy over the landscape, obscuring visibility and making it challenging for soldiers to see more than a few feet in front of them. The ground beneath their feet trembled with the impact of artillery fire, causing men to stumble and lose their footing. On the northern flank, the 12th Infantry Regiment, armed with M1 Garand rifles and supported by a company of M4 Sherman tanks, advanced slowly but steadily against the entrenched enemy positions. The Shermans, with their 75mm guns, provided covering fire as the infantrymen moved forward, trying to exploit weaknesses in the enemy's defenses. However, the enemy was well dug in, and their machine guns and anti-tank guns took a heavy toll on the advancing troops. As the 12th Infantry Regiment pushed forward, they came under intense fire from a nest of enemy machine guns located in a nearby copse of trees. The guns, likely MG-42s, were capable of firing at a rate of 200 rounds per minute, and their bullets ripped through the air with a distinctive and terrifying sound. The American soldiers tried to take cover behind nearby rocks and trees, but the enemy gunners had carefully sighted in their positions, and the bullets seemed to be coming from all directions at once. Lieutenant Colonel Jameson, the regimental commander, quickly assessed the situation and called for artillery support to take out the enemy machine gun nest. A nearby battery of 105mm howitzers, which had been providing indirect fire support to the regiment throughout the morning, was tasked with delivering a precision strike on the enemy position. The howitzers, with their maximum range of 12,000 meters and a rate of fire of 4 rounds per minute, were ideal for this type of mission. As the howitzers began to fire, the battlefield erupted into an even greater level of chaos. The shells screamed through the air, exploding with a deafening crash as they hit their targets. The enemy machine gun nest was quickly overwhelmed, and the guns fell silent as their crews were killed or wounded. However, the respite was short-lived, as the enemy quickly responded with a counter-barrage of their own artillery fire. The American soldiers huddled in their foxholes, trying to avoid the worst of the bombardment as the shells exploded all around them. The ground shook and trembled, and the air was filled with the acrid smell of smoke and the screams of the wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Jameson, who had been observing the battle from a nearby hill, was forced to take cover as a shell exploded just a few feet away, sending shrapnel flying in all directions. Despite the intense artillery fire, the 12th Infantry Regiment continued to push forward, driven by their determination to break through the enemy's defenses. The soldiers moved cautiously, using whatever cover they could find to protect themselves from the withering enemy fire. As they advanced, they began to encounter isolated pockets of enemy resistance, which they quickly overpowered with their superior firepower and training. On the southern flank, the 15th Armored Regiment was making slow but steady progress against the enemy's left wing. The M4 Shermans, with their 75mm guns and powerful engines, were well suited to the armored warfare that characterized this sector of the battlefield. The enemy, however, was not giving up easily, and their own tanks, including the formidable Panther and Tiger models, were putting up a fierce resistance. The Panthers, with their 75mm guns and sloping armor, were particularly troublesome, as they seemed almost invulnerable to the Sherman's gunfire. The Tigers, with their 88mm guns and massive size, were even more daunting, and the American tank crews approached them with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Despite these challenges, the 15th Armored Regiment persevered, using their superior numbers and maneuverability to outflank and overwhelm the enemy tanks. As the battle raged on, the logistical support teams worked tirelessly to keep the troops supplied with ammunition, food, and medical care. The quartermasters, responsible for managing the flow of supplies, worked around the clock to ensure that Th-9 frontline units received the materials they needed to keep fighting. The medical teams, including doctors, nurses, and stretcher bearers, risked their lives to evacuate the wounded and provide emergency care on the battlefield. The supply chain, which stretched all the way back to the ports and depots in the rear, was a complex and delicate system that required precise planning and coordination to function effectively. The logisticians, using a combination of trucks, trains, and planes, worked to keep the supplies flowing, often under difficult and dangerous conditions. As the battle intensified, the logistical support teams played an increasingly critical role in determining the outcome, as the side that could maintain its supply lines and keep its troops equipped and fed would ultimately emerge victorious. As the day wore on, the fighting showed no signs of letting up, with both sides trading blows and neither gaining a decisive advantage. The American commanders, including Lieutenant Colonel Jameson and Colonel Thompson, the brigade commander, began to consider their next move, weighing the risks and benefits of continuing to push forward against the entrenched enemy positions. The enemy, too, was reassessing its situation, trying to determine how to stem the tide of the American advance and stabilize its defenses. The outcome of the battle was still very much in doubt, as the two armies clashed in a frenzy of gunfire, explosions, and hand-to-hand combat. The soldiers on both sides, driven by their training, discipline, and determination, fought on with courage and ferocity, each one knowing that the fate of the war, and perhaps the fate of the world, hung in the balance. As the sun began to set on the battlefield, casting a golden glow over the carnage and destruction, the fighting showed no signs of slowing, and the ultimate victor remained to be seen. As the cacophony of war reached a fever pitch, the battlefield transformed into a sprawling, nightmarish tapestry, woven from the very fabric of chaos and destruction. The acrid stench of smoke and sweat hung heavy in the air, a noxious miasma that clung to every surface, every soldier, and every bullet-riddled corpse. The earth itself seemed to tremble, as if the land was being torn asunder by the sheer ferocity of the clash. The artillery, those behemoths of steel and fire, continued to belch forth their lethal cargo, each shell screaming through the air like a banshee, leaving in its wake a trail of shattered bodies and shattered dreams. The ground shook beneath the feet of the soldiers, as if the very foundations of the earth were being rent asunder, sending tremors through the ranks, threatening to topple the already precarious balance of power. In the midst of this bedlam, the infantry surged forward, a tidal wave of flesh and blood, driven by a frenzied determination to claim the contested ground. Bayonets glinted in the faint, flickering light, like 1,000 tiny suns, as me soldiers clashed in a frenzy of steel and fury. The air was heavy with the cries of the fallen, the screams of the wounded, and the battle cries of the advancing troops, a symphony of sound that threatened to consume all in its path. Every second was a lifetime, every moment a universe unto itself, as the soldiers fought, died, and killed, their actions dictated by a mixture of training, instinct, and primal fear. A corporal, his face a mask of grime and blood, sprinted across the open ground, his rifle clutched tightly in his sweat-slickened hands, as he desperately sought to reach the relative safety of a nearby crater. A bullet, its path unpredictable and deadly, sliced through the air, striking the corporal with the force of a sledgehammer, sending him crashing to the ground, his body twitching spasmodically as his life force ebbed away. Nearby, a lieutenant, his eyes blazing with a fierce, almost feral intensity, rallied his troops, his voice rising above the din of battle as he urged them onward, into the very jaws of hell. His words, a potent mixture of inspiration and desperation, galvanized the soldiers, imbuing them with a renewed sense of purpose, as they hurled themselves forward, a human wave, crashing against the enemy lines, seeking to shatter the defenses and claim the day. The enemy, however, was far from defeated, and they responded to the onslaught with a ferocity that was both beautiful and terrifying. A withering hail of bullets, a veritable storm of steel, swept across the battlefield, cutting down the advancing troops, sending them tumbling to the ground, their bodies broken, battered, and bleeding. The lieutenant, his voice still ringing out, fell to the ground, his legs shattered by a bullet, his vision blurring, as his life force began to slip away. In the midst of this carnage, a young soldier, barely out of his teens, found himself alone, separated from his unit, and adrift in a sea of chaos. His eyes wide with fear, his heart pounding in his chest, he stumbled forward, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands, as he desperately sought to find his place in the battle. A figure, looming in the distance, a monstrous apparition, emerged from the smoke, its face twisted into a grotesque mask of hatred as it raised its own rifle, taking aim at the young soldier. Time seemed to slow as the soldier waited, frozen in terror, for the inevitable bullet, his mind racing, his thoughts consumed by the crushing certainty of his own mortality. The figure, its finger tightening on the trigger, seemed to be savoring the moment, drawing out the suspense, as the soldier's life hung in the balance. And then, in an instant, the moment was shattered, as a nearby explosion, a deafening blast of sound and fury, sent the figure tumbling to the ground, its rifle flying from its grasp, as the soldier, seizing the opportunity, sprinted forward, his heart still racing, his senses reeling, but his determination renewed. The battle raged on, a seemingly endless maelstrom of chaos, as the soldiers, on both sides, fought with a frenzied intensity, their actions driven by a toxic mixture of fear, adrenaline, and desperation. Every second was a struggle, every moment a battle, as the combatants clashed, in a frenzy of bloodlust, their movements dictated by the primal urge to survive, to kill, and to conquer. The outcome was far from certain, as the tide of battle ebbed and flowed. Like a living, breathing creature, its twists and turns unpredictable, and its ultimate destination unknown. In this vortex of violence, the soldiers found themselves lost, their identities subsumed by the sheer ferocity of the clash, as they became mere extensions of their rifles, their bayonets, and their explosive ordnance. The world, once a complex, multifaceted tapestry, had been reduced to a simple, brutal equation: kill or be killed. Every second was a testament to this stark reality, as the soldiers fought, died, and killed. Their actions, a grim reminder of the horrors that humanity was capable of inflicting upon itself. The artillery, still pounding away, sent shells screaming through the air, their explosions rocking the ground, sending shock waves through the ranks, and threatening to shatter the already fractured remnants of the soldiers' sanity. The infantry, still surging forward, clashed in a frenzy of steel and fury, their movements driven by a maddening desire to claim the contested ground, to plant their flag, and to emerge victorious. The enemy, still resisting, fought with a ferocity that was both beautiful and terrifying. Their actions a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the battle raged on, the soldiers began to lose all sense of time, their minds numbed by the endless barrage of sound, the constant threat of death, and the crushing weight of their own exhaustion. The world, once a vibrant, living, breathing creature, had been reduced to a dull, gray, and lifeless thing, a mere backdrop for the carnage that was unfolding. The soldiers, once human beings, with hopes, fears, and dreams, had been transformed into mere automatons, their actions dictated by a toxic mixture of training, instinct, and primal fears. In this desolate, post-apocalyptic landscape, the soldiers fought on, driven by a maddening desire to survive, to kill, and to conquer. Every second was a struggle, every moment a battle, as they clashed in a frenzy of bloodlust, their movements dictated by the primal urge to endure. The outcome was far from certain, as the tide of battle ebbed and flowed, like a living, breathing creature, its twists and turns unpredictable, and its ultimate destination unknown. The soldiers, lost in this vortex of violence, could only stumble forward, their rifles clutched tightly in their hands, as they desperately sought to find their place in the battle, and to emerge victorious from the carnage that was unfolding. As the dust settled, the landscape before them was one of utter devastation. The ground was scorched, the air thick with the acrid smell of smoke and burned flesh. The once green fields were now nothing but a barren expanse of charred earth, littered with the twisted wreckage of what was left of the enemy's defenses. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the groans of the wounded and the occasional cough of a survivor struggling to clear their lungs of the noxious fumes. The casualty reports began to filter in, each one a grim reminder of the terrible cost of the battle. The numbers were staggering. Over 3,000 enemy soldiers killed or wounded, with countless more fled in terror. But the true horror was the state of the fallen. Many had been incinerated, their bodies reduced to nothing more than smoldering husks. Others had been blown apart, their limbs torn asunder by the relentless barrage of artillery fire. The survivors stumbled through the wreckage, shell-shocked and dazed, their eyes vacant as they struggled to comprehend the scale of the destruction. Among the survivors was a young soldier named Jenkins. He had been lucky, managing to find cover behind a nearby boulder just as the artillery fire reached its crescendo. Now, as he emerged from his makeshift shelter, he was met with a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his days. His best friend, a fellow soldier named Thompson, lay nearby, his body ravaged by shrapnel. Jenkins stumbled forward, his eyes streaming with tears as he fell to his knees beside his friend's lifeless body. He cradled Thompson's head in his lap, gently stroking his hair as he whispered a silent prayer. Nearby, a medic named Rodriguez worked tirelessly to tend to the wounded. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her hands moving swiftly as she bound wounds and administered what little morphine they had. But despite her best efforts, the sheer scale of the carnage was overwhelming. She worked in a daze, her mind numbed by the constant stream of horrors that lay before her. A young soldier, no more than 20 years old, lay on the ground, his leg torn apart by a shell fragment. Rodriguez knew that he wouldn't survive, but she worked to make him comfortable, her hands moving with a quiet tenderness as she injected him with a final dose of morphine. As the day wore on, the full extent of the devastation became clear. The enemy's defenses had been breached, their lines shattered by the relentless barrage of artillery fire. But at what cost? The fields were littered with the bodies of the dead and the dying, the air thick with the stench of death. The survivors stumbled through the wreckage, their eyes vacant, their minds reeling from the horrors they had witnessed. In the midst of this chaos, a small group of soldiers managed to find a sense of purpose. They worked together, moving through the wreckage to search for any survivors who might still be trapped beneath the rubble. It was a perilous task, the ground treacherous with hidden dangers. But they worked with a quiet determination, their hearts driven by a sense of duty and compassion. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the devastated landscape, the soldiers finally stumbled upon a small group of survivors. They were huddled together, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. The soldiers moved swiftly, working to free the trapped men from the wreckage. It was a slow and painstaking process, but eventually, they managed to extricate the survivors, pulling them to safety just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The night that followed was one of darkness and despair. The survivors huddled together, their faces lit only by the faint moonlight that filtered through the clouds. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices barely above a whisper, as they struggled to come to terms with the horrors they had witnessed. The casualty reports continued to filter in, each one a grim reminder of the terrible cost of the battle. But even in the midst of such devastation, there were moments of humanity, of kindness and compassion. A soldier named Martinez shared his last cigarette with a fellow survivor, a small act of kindness that brought a fleeting sense of comfort to the devastated man. As the night wore on, the survivors began to stir, their bodies stiff and sore from the day's exertions. They moved slowly, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. But for now at least, they were safe. The enemy had been defeated, their defenses breached. The survivors had endured the unimaginable, and had emerged, scarred and battered, but alive. They knew that the days ahead would be difficult, that the road to recovery would be long and arduous. But for now, they could take comfort in the simple fact that they had survived, that they had made it through the worst of it. And as they settled in for the long, dark night ahead, they knew that they would face whatever came next, together, as brothers in arms. As we conclude our journey through the labyrinth of military history, it is essential to examine the long-term geopolitical impact of the conflicts we have analyzed. The aftershocks of war can be felt for generations, shaping the destinies of nations and influencing the trajectory of global events. The world we live in today is, in many ways, a product of the military struggles of the past. The rise and fall of empires, the emergence of new world powers, and the redrawing of national borders have all been influenced by the outcome of wars. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, imposed harsh penalties on Germany, contributing to the country's economic instability and creating a fertile ground for the rise of Nazi ideology. The consequences of this treaty are still debated among historians, with some arguing that it contributed to the outbreak of World War II. The aftermath of World War II saw the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers, setting the stage for the Cold War. The division of Europe into Eastern and Western blocs, the formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and the numerous proxy wars fought around the world were all direct consequences of the military alliances and rivalries forged during World War II. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of the Cold War, but the geopolitical landscape continued to evolve, with the rise of new global players like China and the resurgence of nationalist sentiment in various parts of the world. The Middle East, a region ravaged by conflict and instability, provides a stark example of the long-term impact of military interventions. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, which divided the region into spheres of influence controlled by Britain and France, laid the foundation for many of the modern-day conflicts in the area. The creation of Israel in 1948, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and the U.S.-led invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan have all contributed to the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and sectarian tensions that characterize the region today. As we reflect on the legacy of military history, it is essential to recognize the human cost of conflict, the countless lives lost, the families torn apart, and the communities destroyed serve as a poignant reminder of the devastating consequences of war. The impact of war on civilians, often referred to as collateral damage, is a stark reality that must be acknowledged and addressed. The development of international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, has been a crucial step towards mitigating the effects of war on non-combatants. However, the legacy of military history extends beyond the realm of geopolitics and human suffering. It also encompasses the cultural, social, and philosophical dimensions of conflict. The art of war has inspired some of the most iconic works of literature, from Homer's Iliad to Tolstoy's War and Peace. The experience of war has shaped the worldview of countless individuals, influencing their perceptions of humanity, morality, and the meaning of life. As we navigate the complexities of our modern world, it is essential to draw lessons from the past. By studying military history, we can gain a deeper understanding of the factors that contribute to conflict, the importance of diplomacy and international cooperation, and the need for empathy and compassion in our interactions with others. We must recognize that the legacy of military history is not just a series of events, but a rich tapestry of human experiences that can inform and enrich our lives. In the words of the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, "War is the father of all and the king of all, and some he has made gods and some men, some bond and some free." As we contemplate the legacy of military history, we are reminded that war is a fundamental aspect of the human condition, shaping our world and our understanding of ourselves. And yet, it is in the face of conflict and adversity that we discover our greatest strengths, our most profound capacities for compassion, resilience, and hope. As we conclude this journey through the annals of military history, I invite you to subscribe to our channel, where we will continue to explore the complexities of the past, the present, and the future. And together, let us embark on a path of discovery, learning, and growth as we navigate the intricate landscape of human experience. By engaging with the legacy of military history, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and our place in the world, and perhaps, just perhaps, we can create a brighter, more peaceful future for generations to come.